I'm here with Darin Stevenson, who I guess I've known you for about 5 or 7 years through Facebook. Yeah, and we've had one actual conversation through Skype. But you're a presence that is always kind of in the back of my mind. Your posts on Facebook are, let's say, are provocative, and they have some quality of genius to them.
First of all, thank you for taking the time and having the interest to share our minds. You're also a very provocative and fascinating writer, and I find your work to be very inspiring and kind of in line with my own in some ways. And I'm just grateful to have the chance to spend a little time together and explore.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. And another thing I wanted to say was that I've been meaning to, contact you for a while, and I had this idea in the back of my head of having conversations with people who, who I find intriguing in some kind of a way, and also who are not necessarily known to other people. Because in this sort of media landscape, a lot of people who have some kind of something to say fall through the cracks, right? And let's say I have this contact with them on Facebook and I find it very interesting, and then there's this limitation of it being a text conversation, and then I've wanting to take that to the next level and have actual conversations.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. In my relationships that begin in an electronic context, I'm very skeptical about conducting any kind of relationship in text. And in fact, whenever someone reaches out to me and they want to have any kind of a conversation at all, it's pretty common that I'll take a moment and just try to explain to them, even though in the modern context, this may be a little confusing for some people. I don't conduct conversations in text, period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'll occasionally make a rare exception in the case of somebody doesn't have, the technology to do something else, or maybe they live in a place where we can't easily have a phone conversation. But almost invariably, I'll just say, hey, love to talk with you. Let's arrange a time when we can hear each other's voices, or perhaps even better, see each other's faces. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of them have to do with the fact that although there really aren't any methods other than meeting in person that give us privacy back, I'm not happy about having third parties on conversations. Not happy about the knowledge that what we're saying is probably being recorded or analyzed for producing analytics for corporations. I would never invite a corporate representative to an intimate conversation with somebody who I want to talk with. There are no circumstances under which I would even consider such a thing, right? Right. And yet this is pretty much what's happening to all of us all day, every day, even in our telephone conversations, even in this conversation. So, and of course it happens to varying degrees. I'm not particularly paranoid about it. I'm simply aware of it, and I disagree with it. I don't like it. I want to establish ways that no longer happens. Or if we're just living in a world where that's now going to happen all the time, then I think it's very important that we establish a system that delivers the analytics to us and only us.
Mm-hmm.
And then if other people want any access to those analytics, we can limit that access and they have to buy it from us, essentially. So one of the things that concerns me, without going into too much detail about this, is just that we're building pyramids of data for corporations. And the new money in our time is analytic data about individuals and social groups. And for anybody other than us to be in possession of that data is fatally dangerous. It's terrifyingly dangerous. And for people who know anything about history and the history of like how very similar things have been used in the past when there were regime changes or things like this, it's really startling. I've had people explain to me things that happened with a system that was given to Iran in the 1980s by IBM. And when the Shah was ousted and the Ayatollah took over, they basically went through that system, and this was minimal analytic data, right? It's nothing like what we create and are in possession of today. Anyway, the new regime went through that system, invited all the activists and scholars and people who had left the country back, telling them that they'd, be forgiven for any previous wrongdoings, and we want you back in Iran. And when those people came back on airplanes, and my friend's family was among those people, they simply executed them on the tarmac when they landed, just straight up shot them in the head, right? So that's a telling example of what can happen with an intelligence system. Mm-hmm. And the intelligence systems that we're building are so sophisticated now that they easily create the both the reality and the future possibility of directly manipulating our minds, directly manipulating our felt sense of being in the world, our consciousness, what we think about, what we pay attention to. And I don't think anybody realizes just how vulnerable we are to this kind of influence, most of us.
Well, one example I heard was recently, ads being sent to women who don't know that they're pregnant yet. And this means that the internet is developing this kind of subconscious, collective subconscious, right? That's aware of things before your conscious mind is.
Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah, there's all kinds of astonishing things that could be done with and for each other if we established a system where we use the analytics that are produced by our interactions with devices to learn and to grow and to respond to issues or threats together.
Okay, well, maybe we could talk about that, because, sorry to interrupt, I find that these kind of discussions, we're aware of the totalitarian, potential of all this, and that's often discussed, right? But sure. One thing I've noticed about your posts is that or the things you write about, is that you very much make us aware of potential, horrors, of our world and what we do to each other. But also, you also seem to have a utopian sort of view. You seem to have a view that we can harness this technology for the good, the true, and the beautiful, or whatever. So instead of this being just a conversation where we complain about corporations and capitalism and dehumanization, what do you think we can do in this online world? Because I understand a lot of the criticisms you have, and I think of it more on a personal level. Like, I see sort of Facebook as wrecking people's relationships with each other often, and creating very strange artificial relationships with people, and the damage that does, and the kind of collective addiction that we all have. So at the same time, you also seem to be working in your mind towards solutions to these kind of problems. Like, you're a person you describe yourself, I think, as a detective at one point, and somebody who's looking for solutions. So what can you do? What can we do? What, you know?
So first of all, I do think I have a very unusual perspective on how our minds relate with language and concepts and models. And so I have a variety of very intense interests. I'm interested in the mind, how we form minds, how that happens together, what happens if we do it differently, what happens if there's intervening agencies involved, because of course we're aware of this, whether it's conscious or not. I'm interested in dreaming very deeply. I'm interested in hypnosis and how people are influenced. I've been involved with computing technologies pretty much since they were invented as a technician. I've seen how email changed our relationships. I've seen how the onset of first cell phones and then smartphones have changed our relationships. And I opted out of the cell phone and smartphone sort of transformation because I wanted to watch it from outside. Mm-hmm. And I've only within the past 6 months, for the first time, had a mobile phone of any kind. I'm absolutely fascinated and in love with living things. I deeply observe insects and animals and plants, and I relate with them very intimately.
You mentioned, can I just interject here? You mentioned insects, and I've heard you, you know, you've written about insects. And I find that very fascinating. What is your connection to insects?
So first of all, it's just a natural thing. It's the way that I've been since, so I was born this way. Mm-hmm. I absolutely adore living things. And for me, those those are the body of the real. They're not representations. I mean, they can be understood in various ways, but, and so since I was a child, I've just had an incredible affinity for living things. And it's a shared affinity. So there's, you know, hundreds of stories of what I think most people would consider to be very unusual events. But I'm a person who, for example, has the experience, and by the way, there are many such people, I've met others like me, who can communicate directly with an insect, something that I think most people would consider to be a ridiculous idea. And I can, for example, talk an insect onto my hand, carry it around with me. If there's a fly buzzing around in my window, I can get the fly on my hand and just carry it out the back door. If there's a moth or a wasp or any kind of little creature. And of course, every event's unique. And I'm not trying to claim that I have any special, like, supernatural power or anything like that. I think rather that we've, as moderns, because of the context we're usually involved in and what we're taught to, how we're taught to see life and think about life, we're just confused, right? We're missing 90% of the abilities and affinities that are natural to our humanity, and recovering those is something that I'm very passionate about. So I've been a friend and observer of insects and tiny creatures since I was a child. And I've learned so much. I continue to learn so much from that relationship always. And I think there's something that I'd like to say briefly about my perspective of life on Earth and what's kind of going on here. And I'll return to some of the other questions in a moment. So in some branches of human subculture, there's a fascination with aliens. And this, you know, is the idea that there are other intelligent life forms, possibly either from other dimensions or from other planets in space, that from time to time or maybe regularly visit Earth. And that's a really complex topic. Some of it has to do with psychosis.
Well, it's funny. I was thinking about that while when you mentioned insects. I'd already made that connection.
See, yeah, I'm going to go here. So, the topic of extraterrestrial intelligence and is one topic, and then there's this sort of related topic, which is how that gets dealt with in human subcultures, and particularly media cultures. And so there's some really fascinating and useful and intelligent exploration of this idea, and then there's some really bizarre, kind of psychotic, paranoid examination of this topic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very sophisticated mess that we don't have to, thankfully, we don't have to tease that apart right now. But what I wanted to say is something relatively simple that I find both shocking and exciting, which is that, when people see organisms that they consider to be exotic, like octopi or praying mantises or wasps or mantis shrimp, for example, nudibranchs, you'll often hear them say, "Oh, it looks like an alien." Well, how would they know what an alien looks like? I mean, what inclines them to suspect that something that's strange, like why is their first move, that must be like from another world, right? That looks like a thing from a science fiction movie. Well, part of the reason for that is simply that science fiction movies get their inspiration like we do for our devices and everything. Everything that we get, that we make something of, originates in nature, right? So science fiction movies have been stealing insects and exotic animals and sort of transposing those onto their presentations of aliens, right? So we've been kind of trained to think that way. But
well, is it terror of the uncanny and the unknown, and what is furthest away from our, let's say, sense of ourselves?
Sure, that's part of it. I think we've basically, unfortunately, many people have been trained to be xenophobic. They're actually just afraid of living things in general. Living things aren't predictable. They don't fit into our representational paradigms. They don't listen to the language. They're intimately involved in their experience of being alive rather than our desires or representations of how things should be or whatever. So they're sort of unpredictable, and that makes them scary, and they could hurt us. Or
like my wife, for example, is absolutely petrified of spiders, right? And I love them. I could take them in my hand and
I'm the same way.
And I don't particularly understand that fear, because it's so completely built into her nature in some way. It's almost like, I guess she could probably overcome it through exposure to it, if she really wanted to. But why is that kind of fear seems to be deeply built into a lot of people, a fear of the strange, right? Or what they consider to be strange, and maybe it's partly fear of themselves, that they are the alien, or they're alien to themselves.
There's some fears that are relatively natural, I think, for primates, right? And the three that stand out to my thought in the moment are spiders and insects, wasps, bees, things like that. Things bite you, hurt you. They can be small. You can't find them. You can't control them. You don't know if they're on. Is there one on me or not? Right? Like there's a lot of kind of scary things that one could imagine about them. The other is snakes. Snakes have been a problem for primates from time immemorial, and part of the reason that snakes are frightening is that they can be invisible in the environment until they strike you. Right. So that's and this is the same thing with spiders, right? You don't know, is there a spider on me right now? You can't really be sure there isn't, right? Yeah. And then the third thing would be like large apex predators, lions. Jaguars used to eat human beings all the time in South America. Panthers, which actually there's no such thing as a panther. That's sort of a pet name for a class of animals. Lions, tigers, stuff like that. Mice, right, are another one. So there's some stuff that might just be sort of hereditarily common for us humans to be afraid of, and some of that has to do with something that may or may not be pretty natural to our animal form, and then another aspect of it has to do with how we're enculturated. So one of the things I found very confusing as a child was, and actually very painful, was just that most of the other humans and adults saw small creatures as something to be destroyed, often as a form of entertainment, or, you know, just if it moves, kill it. So I think there's a sort of xenophobia, that a fear of living things.
Fear of living things, yeah.
An aggressive fear of living things that's pretty commonly instanced in human persons and cultures. But I want to get back to where I was going about insects and exotic creatures and aliens. So one of the things that's just blatantly obvious to me, and it's a little bit surprising that it's not more obvious to other people, however, our alienation from living things, if we have that, if an individual or group is experiencing that, that gets sort of reprojected, right? And the aliens from the sky thing is part of that projection in some cases.
Yeah,
right?
obviously, yeah.
Terrified of living, we are alienated from living things, and that creates this sort of pseudo projection of our alienation that then could produce, for example, some form of life or a being that was to us as we are to living things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I can imagine this process of projection happening. But what I actually find intriguing, and you know, you mentioned like there's these two branches, right? There's what am I concerned about, and what are the positive things we can do, right? So I'm concerned about human xenophobia. It's wiping out, you know, the remaining conserved ecologies, which are the single most precious thing in our living aspect as human beings. These are the most precious thing, the ecologies that remain, in my view. And I can get into why that.
Primeval, original ecologies.
Well, just whatever's been conserved, right? Whatever we've still got left is sort of how I think of it.
Yep.
So those, like, if you were to just point your finger out into space, right, in some direction toward the sky, right, and you just followed that line for who knows what, 50,000 light years, 100,000 light years, it'd be very, very unlikely that along that line you'd come across life. It's not impossible, we don't know, but a world as paradisically fraught with explosions of complex organismal sentience and transsentience and networks of life, you're not going to find it. Like this, whatever there might be out in space, the one thing we can be sure of is that it's not friendly to life. It doesn't mean there's none out there, right? But if you put a human, you know, in a space station or something like this, it's a completely against life environment. And here we have this amazing sort of evolutionary accelerator with all these trillions of different conservations. And it's just, to me, this is the absolutely most precious thing. But what I wanted to say, long way around here, is that Earth is a planet in space. And so what that fundamentally means is that what we think of as alien life, you know, life on other worlds, well, that's what our world's made of.
That's us.
We are alien life. Like if you go to a planet in space and there's life on it, that's life from space-time, right? That's crazily exotic, unexpectedly amazing life, right? So
can I just throw something at you here?
Hang on for just a moment. I need to check in here. Hello. Hi. I'm still on for the moment. Is there anything we need to, are we just going to check in? Okay. I'll call you back. Thanks. Sorry about that.
No worries. Can I throw something? Can I just?
Yeah, let me just finish what I'm saying.
Okay, excuse me.
Briefly. So, when we look at any organism on Earth, from my perspective, or a perspective that I prefer, what we're seeing are the qualities and characters of time-space, uniquely instanced in an organism. And what that means to me is that Earth is like this unimaginably sophisticated library of organismal forms and relationships and sentience. It's a mirror of the fundamental nature of time-space. And that mirror is infinitely, profoundly exotic and beautiful and intelligent and shocking to directly encounter when we are in a state of mind where we become available to that. So one of the things that I'd like to help people who are interested to understand is that we have this incredible opportunity to contact non-human intelligence right here on Earth. And the chances of us doing that with a spacecraft are essentially zero, right? We have everything we need to touch the intelligence of time-space and intelligences that we might imagine exist on other worlds right here. And we're busy burning that down to make spaceships to go nowhere, that we're gonna, like, we're just not gonna find complex organisms anywhere near our planet. It's extremely unlikely. Not impossible, but extremely unlikely. So it's ironic and common that we're burning up exactly what we hope to encounter because we're presuming that we can only find life from time-space on other planets, right? And this is a typically human kind of myopia. Whereas what's actually going on here is more than anything we've ever imagined to be going on other planets. And in fact, I strongly suspect that if there are living planets in space-time, and I believe there probably are, that these planets share information across impossible distances, and that information is involved with the forms and development of life on Earth directly, so that not only do we have a library of what has happened here on Earth, I believe that the relationship between living planets in space-time is expressed here, and that means that, at least in theory, we would have access to the intelligences that have evolved on other worlds right here, without having to go anywhere. And this is part of my suspicion about the nature of time-space in general, which is that you can't have a living world like this unless all the others are included. In other words, what you'll find out there, you can find right here.
Mm-hmm. So, when there's these religious, people have religious experiences, is that what's happening? Are they contacting what you would call alien life forces?
Well, that's a very sophisticated topic. And like most of the topics that we might examine about humans in general, and I'd like to make a distinction here between talking abstractly about something that we're not actually in the presence of, that we're not right with right now, right? About people in general, or the abstract idea that there's a we. We often say like we, without actually having formed a we, right? We're just talking about some idea we have about if there was a we, or the we that we're passively included in because we live in America, something like that. To distinguish between talking about contexts and persons abstractly and actually being directly engaged with a person or a situation that we're examining while we're engaged with it, because these are two very different kinds of thought that we're not careful enough about, in my perspective. And it's useful just to acknowledge the difference. And we don't have to say one is wrong or one is right, but it's useful to notice when we move to the abstract, people in general, or the topic in general,
Yeah.
and then we talk about something specific.
I
So
find myself doing that actually. I hear my voice and I think I'm just using words which are, you know, modes of sort of communication which are superficial because I can't get really to the heart of what I'm trying to say. So it's this kind of blah, blah, blah.
sure,
You understand what I'm saying?
I do.
So I just throw these concepts up in the air, but there's a difference between, let's say, felt communication and just dry abstraction. Or
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think very carefully about how we relate with language and concepts. So this is part of why I'm aware of this. But to return to your question, um, when we talk about people having religious experiences, we have the same kind of confusions and problems that we have if we talk about people who claim to have encountered aliens, right? We have vast range of incredible diversity. We have people who it's very clear from the results have had some kind of very authentic experience
mm-hmm.
and can communicate something very meaningful about this experience. Or sometimes not, but it's still obvious like this is a real thing. And then we have a whole range of stuff that's delusional or based on a narrative, a story that they believe, or is actually psychotic. So we've got this whole range of things. But to answer your question, sure, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
when people claim to have a spiritual experience,
So
have.
would you be comfortable in speaking about any of the kind of experiences that you've had?
Sure, I would. To finish, sometimes when people are telling stories about experiences they've had, that may be an experience of contact with some kind of non-human intelligence. But even that phrase brings in a wide range of possibilities. So I think I might discriminate between what I would call contact with a non-human intelligence, which of course can happen with a tree or a bird or an insect, but there's again a vast range and probably levels of complexity. And then a spiritual experience, which perhaps has more to do with a relationship with features of the universe that are ordinarily invisible to us. And that may include beings that are ordinarily not part of our conscious experience. Or
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, that's how I would begin to respond to that question. Is just that there's a vast range of possibilities, and we need to take each case somewhat uniquely, because each person is unique, and each person is unique in every moment and circumstance that they're in. But yeah, sometimes contact with non-human intelligence could have to do with something in nature, and perhaps religious experiences have to do with something that I might frame as an experience of the aspect of reality that is related to origin, where everything comes from.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
In the same way, I can think of Earth as a mirror in which all of the intelligences of time space are reflected in actual organisms.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I can also think of Earth as a mirror in which the world of origin is reflected in forms and relationships and dreaming.
So the difference is between an experience of the source of all these other experiences and all the different manifestations of that source.
Yeah.
And you know, I know that when I was in my 20s, I did psychedelics and had kind of unusual experiences, but then I got kind of sick of that, and it didn't seem to go anywhere. There seemed to be an infinite amount of experiences that you could have. But then after that, I started to get into meditation, which was more like a cleaning up of the mind than a going into to all the different forms of experience.
Yes. And I too have been a practitioner of Zen meditation now for some 30 years. So I have some familiarity with that particular branch of meditation, though I don't necessarily consider myself a Buddhist.
Okay.
If I may,
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to return to an earlier question that you had. And I'll preface this by saying, people who are considered by others to be very intelligent, I think everybody's very intelligent. I just think it gets expressed uniquely in each human being and each group. But intellectuals particularly suffer from this kind of disease that I'll call share the damage. And it's this thing where, you know, people go around telling each other about the bad news and the terrifying future and the incredible problem and this kind of thing. And it's been my experience that this is an extremely toxic habit. Not only does it not solve the problem, it's debilitating for the people who are subjected to it. And some of my closer friends in my youth were the first people that I saw exhibiting symptoms of this problem and sharing the damage. And to say I'm not a fan is a gross understatement of that kind of behavior, because it's just catastrophic, both for the person who becomes involved in that habit and for the people who they communicate with. It's really like spreading and magnifying a disease of helplessness and fear. So although I talk about problems and dangers that we face as moderns, my felt sense of those problems is creative, and I like to backtrace the problem to its origins and what motivates its forms and its expressions, and then see how those can be inverted.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been studying social media now for probably 12, 15 years closely, and my primary interest was in both understanding the dangers involved and then perhaps inventing something that could invert those dangers and give us not only freedom from the dangers, but access to the opportunities.
Right, because when you went on Facebook, I remember you saying that I've come here to warn people that this is a destructive technology. And at the same time, you were saying, well, there's this incredible power and possibility happening here simultaneously. So which is it?
Absolutely, it isn't either. It's what we do with it that makes that decision. So, for example,
how do we use Facebook? How do we use social media in a way that's constructive to our souls rather than destructive?
Well, you and I both experiment with this, so we obviously have some felt sense and experience of exploring that.
Yeah.
And for all the dangers Facebook presents, it's also extremely useful because I've been able to form relationships on Facebook that begin on Facebook that are actually part of my life and heart and that are very important to me. And that means that Facebook allowed me to initiate relationships with people who I would otherwise have no possible contact with. So that's one of the positive features of Facebook itself. But I have a model of how we could radically invert the systems that we're presently subjected to and we opt into. And it's not something I'm particularly on fire about evangelizing, but I find it the potentials for astonishing new ways of being human and intelligent together to be really exciting.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, so I'm going to do my 4-minute elevator pitch here. All right.
Okay.
Trying to keep it really brief. We're using a browser that was invented in 1989. It's 2018. Time on the internet is very accelerated. So for something like thousands of years of human experience, we've been using this incredibly antiquated piece of garbage that actually changes our minds to work like it, and it works like the index of a book. And our minds don't work like the index of a book at all.
It's like music too. It's the same. It's analogous to music in listening to MP3s, right? And CDs, which are kind of antiquated sonic experiences, which are stuck in 1985 or.
Right. So we're getting all kinds of artifacting, right? Compression damage to our minds, and because of our relationships with machines and the metaphors that they subconsciously and consciously present, we're in danger of having our fundamental way of being in the world and our minds changed to be like broken old machines. So in any case, it's now it would be a simple map. No one has even had one better idea than the way we currently interface with the internet, which is through an incredibly antiquated browser that really hasn't changed since it was invented. So the first thing we could do is invent a browser that works more like our minds and involves like images for the right hemisphere and language for the left hemisphere. I mean, if sitting in my room right now, right, I have books over here, television and images over here. And if you look in people's rooms, you're going to see this all over the place. Like, it's not absolutely the same in every place, but you're going to find out that people naturally organize their world for hemispheric lateralization, right? You're going to see books on one side, images on the other, essentially, and this kind of thing. So we could build a browser that works more like our minds and that uses the intelligence of connotation rather than denotation, right? So
can you explain that? Yeah.
Yes. So we understand things not by their literal definitions, but by their associations. This is how our minds more like how our minds work, right?
How the right hemisphere works.
No, they both work this way.
Okay.
If you didn't have associations, your left hemisphere would be incapable of understanding words.
Okay. But what I've understood from McKilgreth's book is that the right hemisphere is metaphorical and makes sort of wilder kind of contextual associations, whereas the left brain is more literal and map making and.
That's true, but they're both involved in each other's processes, right? Okay. There's not a really clear distinction. So one of the things that I would do is I would build a browser that works much more like our minds. And instead of telling you a lot about what that would look like, although it's pretty astonishing, I'll continue with the other portions of the model that I have. So step one would be a browser that actually works more like our minds and continually learns how our minds work individually and as groups. Mm-hmm. The second aspect would be the localization of all of our analytic data in a specific artifact, right? A file, if you will, that has layers, right? So there'd be like a world layer, a national layer, a local layer, an acquaintance layer, a close friends layer, a family layer, and a personal layer, right? And it would organize and allow us to make use of all of the analytic data that's produced by our interactions with devices, all of it, because a lot more of this is coming than is presently at hand. There's going to be health data, there's going to be analytics from having our bodies read by machines, our eye movements, our pulses, our breathing, probably our blood pressure, stuff like this. And even relatively primitive devices are already capable of this, like the Kinect for Xboxes can tell what your eyes are doing and stuff like this, and can read your pulse. So that kind of stuff is incredibly dangerous to put in the hands of other people, like so dangerous that it's unimaginably dangerous, right? But we could do something really astonishing with that data if we gathered it for ourselves and for each other in networks of related interest and activity.
Is this related to your concept of pods? Like you talked about a pod being the kind of ultimate sort of human organization, like, and you related that to a pod of dolphins.
Yeah, I mean, I fundamentally believe that humans are animals that were evolved to function healthily and effectively in small, very tightly knit groups of shared interest and concern.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, in case this isn't clear, or if someone wants an example, you can just look at a representation of that, which is a sports team,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Or a
And
tribe,
mm-hmm. Right? They do the impossible. They're considered to be like superhuman, right? Another example would be like a rock band. I mean, you get like 500,000 people together to watch a bunch of guys kicking a ball. Why?
Yeah.
Why is that so compelling? Well, it's so compelling because we're not doing it. So we want to participate in the sort of projected representation of that happening. And I mean, another thing that's really interesting to me is just like, what if we got those 500,000 people together for something that actually mattered, even for an hour? Like, what could we do with that? So we were talking about a solution, and I mentioned that I have a model, and the model has 5 or 6 elements. One is a browser that works more like our minds and learns how each of our individual minds work. One is the data artifact that's associated with our analytics, and this is something that can be developed both personally and in layers of networks. So this is one of the most astonishing things, is we could actually build data artifacts like this. I call it the Ka, which really just means knowledge artifact, but has that interesting synonymy with the Egyptian soul or whatever. Each of these features is very sophisticated, and what I'm going to present is just a really simple, quick model. So the Ka, we could actually build a Ka for people who no longer are alive, so that you could search the internet the way Einstein's mind worked, or the way some, like Henry Thoreau's mind worked. You could build a Ka from text-based records of people's writing even before the internet existed. And you could just basically swap out like someone else's Ka for yours and get an experience of relating with information more like another person's mind or the mind of a group. All kinds of features that we have nothing even vaguely resembling today. So the knowledge artifact is the fundamental heart of the system, which I call the knowledge amp.
So it would be like searching in somebody's mind? I'm just having a hard time to understand.
The Ka informs how information is related with, and it informs it by using the analytic data that we've gathered about ourselves or another person or a group. And that becomes the, how to put this, the organizing perspective for a search or relating with information. And it's basically just a layered resource made from analytics. And those analytics can inform each other in networks. And the basic model of this involves what I'd call human-assisted artificial intelligence. So we teach machines how to learn about us rather than
the other way around.
Yeah, rather than the other way around.
Got it. Yeah.
And I think the future really lies in that direction.
And that is the essential problem with artificial intelligence, isn't it? That the machine would have control over the human rather than the other way around. Or that's
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of problems. So the first problem I have is that I think the idea of artificial intelligence is just simply wrong. There's no such thing as artificial intelligence. What we're actually doing is computation. We should call that computation. We shouldn't call it intelligence. If our species is intelligent, I can't find much evidence of that. So before we could invent an artificial intelligence, we would probably have to ourselves become reasonably intelligent or have some idea, a meaningful idea, a healthy idea of what intelligence actually means and looks like. Mm-hmm. And to me, it doesn't mean or look like what we usually associate with it. But to stay on topic briefly, so there's a browser that works like our minds. There's a localized store of analytic data that can include and be informed by all of our interactions with information, emails, texts, whatever we make, whatever we do, even biomedical data. Then there's a thing that I call the, it's funny, I haven't thought about this in a little while. So there's an aspect of the model that we would build a database that would allow us to have essentially a readout on any media item that we might be exposed to. A piece of news, a video of someone talking about something, a text, an email. And what this would allow us to do is to get very sophisticated analytic data about the origins of a piece of media, what related topics informed it, who's making money if it gets circulated, what the agenda of the creator is. So it's a vetting sentinel. That's the excuse me. That's the specific title I came up with. Excuse me.
So how would that not become something that would be another form of surveillance? Like, you know, this is just
We're going to have that anyway. So the question is, do we build it for each other in ways that are useful and helpful and help us to be smarter, or do we let other people do it for us?
Right. So let's say
have a vetting sentinel in our minds. Like, one of the reasons why I have this element is we each have one of these already with which we determine whether information is trustworthy or not. Whose interest is this information in? And the problem with the one that we have is that it's extremely poorly educated. So the goal of creating a human-assisted AI version of the vetting sentinel would be to eliminate the possibility of content that was mostly lies, mostly propaganda, identify rhetorical errors or movements in texts or speeches from political people. We would just get a window of incredible usefulness into the authenticity or the lack thereof of various media items. And one of the things that would do is it would kill garbage, right? It would just totally expose stuff that it was completely made up or filled with lies or just propaganda. It would make it really, really difficult for example, political people to speak in any way that could be authorized by any audience after having been taken apart this way.
Okay. So again, I'm still having this, I have this reservation in the sense that I was like, you know, let's say I put this video up, me and you talking, and then somebody can find layers of, you know, of what is real and what is not real. Who decides what is real and not, and what is not real? And how do we model that correctly? I mean,
it's a good question. So,
what's the authority here, like behind it? I mean,
so firstly, very few human beings are rhetorically educated. And what that means is they are not intelligent enough to understand the difference, for example, as an example, between something that absolutely cannot be true, something that it's impossible that this thing is true, something that might be true, and something that is relatively likely to be true in a specific context, since true, right, is a pretty deep idea, right? We're just talking about the context of people speaking to each other or communicating to each other about circumstances, ideas, situations, and relationships. So because most human beings are very poorly rhetorically educated, and by the way, not so very long ago in the wealthy classes in Europe, rhetorical education was a fundamental part of elementary school education. They taught children these skills. So our linguistic and conceptual intelligence as moderns has been under assault and is, you know, in a terrible state of disrepair. So one of the simplest things we could do is just point out rhetorical fallacies in a text. And that's something that you can train a machine to do all day long. And it's just a fact, right? This way of saying this thing is both a lie, you know, or an exaggeration, or a manipulative move meant to deceive, right? Just that one thing. If we could do just that one thing, that would have a staggering effect. And that's something that can be done.
Well, wouldn't it kind of destroy 99% of the discourse between human beings? I mean, 99%.
No, it wouldn't destroy 99%
most of the stuff people talk about is kind of bullshit, right? I mean, just on an everyday basis, you know.
But it might help us to learn how to think and speak in ways that were more intelligent. And it wouldn't destroy anything. It would just give us feedback when we're being exposed to media about whether or not this is in any way reasonably trustworthy, right? You can still make your own decision, right? You don't have to obey the machine readout, but just this one feature of rhetorical analysis, and there's lots of other amazing stuff we can do. And in terms of who is the authority, there isn't a central authority. It's a distributed authority. It's humans teaching the vetting sentinel, both individually, right, about like my own habits, because the vetting sentinel will be informed by each caw and each network of caws, right? So this is a very sophisticated system that I'm trying to present in a very rapid way. So I'm just going to go back over the three, and I'll answer any questions in a second. So a browser that works more like our minds, the local collection of analytic data that we own. That artifact is something that becomes more and more valuable over time. And if corporations want any access to that, they have to pay us. So this is something that would be like an heirloom, right? That every person who uses the internet, if they wanted to opt in, could make money from allowing limited buffered access to that analytic data to corporations that want to use it for various purposes instead of just building it for them.
Give and take rather than just a take.
Right. So that would invert that model. Then we have the vetting sentinel that would give us a window into how trustworthy is what I'm looking at. What are the orientations and agendas that are being promoted here? Who makes money if this is circulated? That would give us a lot of analytic data about the media that we're exposed to. And it would learn how to do that both in a group sense from the whole network and also in an individual sense from a given person or a given group of people or subgroup. Then there would be a social media aspect that would be like Facebook, except again, the analytics come to us instead of them. And then the final component is a team building social adventure aspect where we have an avatar in this universe and we form teams to accomplish specific goals that we share with other people. And that avatar acquires, it's a gamification of social activism, essentially. So the avatar acquires an identity and a history and abilities and statistics about what they've been involved in, what they've accomplished, so that people could actually playfully compete to solve specific problems that are facing us as cultures, social groups, and human beings in general. And that's the essential model of the knowledge animal.
Well, there's a few things I find interesting there. It's a new model of education, right? Because I think obviously we're moving in that direction. And the other thing that interests me is what you say about social justice, that gamification, because social justice today is so corrupt. It seems to me, you know, how people approach social justice is always to be out on the street with placards, you know, against this monolithic, you know,
useless,
and it doesn't seem to be very intelligent.
No.
So in order to create a better world, we have to redefine what social justice, it seems to me what social justice means.
Agreed.
So that's
something that has to be done.
I can understand that from what you're telling me, and also just finding new organizing principles for the you know, for how we are becoming, you know, changing, or how we're changing.
I
Um,
can't even explain the profound opportunities that would, I mean, many of them can't be imagined until the system's instanced, but even just imagining a system like this presents staggering opportunities for our humanity and for how we relate with each other and how we relate with information, that unless we do something like this, we're going to get the opposite of it, right? We're going to get subjected.
well,
We're being colonized
already
right now.
we're already sort of, there is a sense, right, that human beings are sort of destroying each other. I mean, there's a feeling that this is what we're doing. I don't think I'm alone in. I think a lot of people feel that generally. It's good that you have some other. There's an optimistic message rather than just you know, the sort of nihilism, which
We
seems.
could build the basis of a system like this in 6 months, right now,
Uh huh. Well, why aren't we doing that? Well,
because nobody's had this idea.
okay. So you
And
have
it's,
enough.
you know,
You
in
have
terms
enough.
of my idea, it's up to me to put the model together, market it, do something like that. So I'll take responsibility for not having completely done that yet. I have both um, distractions, right? I'm a human being. I live an actual human life.
Yeah.
And I also have fears. Um, I can't tell what such a powerful system, what effect that would have on the future of humanity, or what kinds of really dangerous things could be associated with it. It's unpredictable. Although my answer to that problem is simply, well, what's going on right now, what we're not doing, and what we're being subjected to is catastrophically worse than anything this could probably produce. So, I mean, our privacy is being colonized. Our minds are being colonized. Our social networks are being colonized and redirected by forces that aren't human. Right? Corporations are not human beings. They're not beings. They're like complicated ghosts. So it's a terrifying situation that we're actually in. And I think very few people, it's not useful to sit around being terrified of it. I think very few people understand the actual implications of the capacity, for example, for your computer to know your heart rate and know when your pupils are dilating or constricting,
Mm-hmm.
right? This will allow corporations to directly manipulate our emotions, our minds, our interests, our attention in a way that is slave-like. And the dangers of a system like that are staggering. And that's what's coming because our machines are becoming more and more intimately connected with our bodies. So we need to move quickly to invent systems that both protect us from those dangers
Mm-hmm.
and grant us the opportunities implicit in the technologies. And unexpectedly, this is a re-instancing of historical problems that begin in our own lives and in the history of our species with language. Language is the technology. It's a technology that does the same kinds of things that we're talking about here, but we never mastered it. We were not given the powers to creatively and intelligently relate with this technology. And so many, generations later, we are primarily dominated by it. And
You
that's,
mean we're dominated by language? I mean,
yes.
we're dominated by these sort of, you know, language forms which hypnotize our minds in some kind of way to act
And
against
redirect our attention.
against our own better nature.
Yeah. They limit and focus and direct our attention in certain ways that, while they might be useful in some contexts, are devastating in others. And we have no sense, we're not trained yet, and we can learn and train each other to be this way. So there's an opportunity. And this is something that I'm very involved with and care about. But yeah, language is the first fatally dangerous technology, right? And all of the other similar things emerge in its shadow. We need to be, in my perspective, it's crucial that we become extremely intelligent and that we learn and teach each other how to understand our relationships with language and concepts,
Mhm.
and how to not be crippled by those relationships, how to both avoid the dangers and become and help each other to acquire direct access to the opportunities. Because like all technologies, we're not going to get rid of them, right? We can't just go around saying like, well, language is really dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then what?
Well,
Right?
I want to. There was an article by Jonathan Greenwald where he distinguishes between what he calls the red religion and the blue church, right? And the blue church he describes as being, you know, the sort of broadcast model, right, where you know, somebody is telling you something and you're passively, you know, you're absorbing their message, and this is how the 20th century has been working in terms of how to keep populations, you know, under control, etc. And that the red religion model is where there's a back and forth thing going on, and it's much more chaotic and it's much more dangerous, and it's more like, let's say, it's more like YouTube than public TV, right? There's a bunch of people, you know, all kinds of messages are assaulting you all at once, and so we have these two different kind of models, and so on one side it's total chaos, and the other side it's total order, right? How do we create a balanced, you know, system? How do we work with this contradictory aspects of our own nature, even, you know?
So again, I notice the common tendency to speak very abstractly about broad, generalized topics. That's okay. Mm-hmm. Once again, my recommendation about that is only that we recognize when we begin to make such a move. And by we, I actually mean you and me right now. Uh-huh. And this one word, we, is actually a word that it's important to pay a great deal of attention to, how it is being used, and does it refer to an actual we that we intentionally formed together, or does it refer to an abstract we? And in your previous question, it refers to an abstract we. It refers to we and us in general.
Yeah, well, I was talking about, you know, tendencies of culture. I was
sure. No, it's perfectly reasonable.
You,
what you said. I'm not being critical about it. I'm merely recognizing. Okay, this is this mode, right? So we can still relate and talk and do everything we want about that mode. I just think it's important to recognize when we're using it, and there's reasons why that is, which aren't particularly relevant right now. So back to your question. So what you presented is a model of the state of our society and exposure to media. And obviously, each person makes decisions, actively or passively, about how they relate with that situation. Now, if two people or more should come together, like you and I here right now, we actually have come together intentionally for a purpose, then that is the formation of a real we, right? That's a factual we, that we actually have done this. We have chosen to come together. We are here now in real time, speaking and exploring. And if that we wanted to approach the question, it would be very different from what we might imagine if we respond to the question of the generalized we. So for example, for myself, I have a very thick buffer. I have a buffer that protects me from news, from nonsense. I'm extremely selective about what media I'm willing to interact or relate with and why. And that's what I would call the topic of media hygiene, right? How do we each first of all, do we even have any? Is the first question. And then if we do, what are the motivations that inform that? So before we could answer a question as general as the one you posed, we would need probably just to identify some motivations, right? Like, what are our purposes in asking the question? And one of the most amazing things about human beings in general and human beings in particular is both that purposes underlie how they relate with each other and with information. And yet, again, we're very rarely educated enough about this to either notice it clearly or to use it intelligently in our relationships with each other, with the world, with media. So examining purposes and being aware of the purposes that underlie our questions and our desires and our fears is fundamental to forming an intelligent answer. And I think that's a crucial first move in any such dialogue.
Well, most people, well, here I'm making a vast generalization, but
A common one.
I think most people just watch media. They don't have media hygiene. It's just, you know, it's whatever interests you. It's whatever catches your attention. And so you know, and I think I often consume media that way. I go from thing to thing to thing, and I click on stuff that seems kind of attractive, or even horrible, or whatever. It's some kind of it's like a kind of low level addiction that it's almost most of the population has this, right?
Yes.
And maybe that's because maybe that's a substitute for cigarettes or some other kind of addiction that people need to kind of survive, in a sense, in a world that makes all these demands on them and stresses. They have to go to work every day,
and isolates them and crushes them and
yeah.
divides them from the prodigy and genius that is their natural human inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to talk about addiction, for example, it strikes me that most addiction emerges from precisely what I just said. And perhaps most fundamentally from our having been divided from the prodigy and genius that were our natural human inheritance that we brought to birth when we were children, and had then judged, reformed, amputated, punished, not rewarded, not noticed, not recognized.
So society crushes us, is what you're saying.
Does. Not just society, but this is complex and goes back to my concerns about language. It's my perspective that in childhood, we actually undergo a crisis that is rape-like during our exposure to language and concepts. And it happens, of course, it begins in early childhood as we begin to acquire language. But the primary window of this for most children is between 3.5 and 7, with the beginning of the window usually comprising the very challenging aspect of this crisis. And without wanting to introduce religious topics, I can't help but notice in the Bible the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain kills Abel and essentially exiles him to the underworld, which we could understand as what happens when we fall asleep, right? Dreaming. Something like this process actually happens in each human life in our childhood. And a dominating conceptual linguistic authority is established over our humanity and our innate creativity and our capacity to love and feel intimacy and to connect with others in a deep and meaningful way. And society is the re-instancing, the extrinsic re-instancing primarily of that crisis, right? So that's something that I think is crucially important for us to become aware of together and to work with. Now, I'm not wanting to convert anyone to my perspective. It's a perspective that's of course optional, right? Like I don't want to. I'm not an ideologue. I'm not demanding that people see things the way that I see them.
Yeah.
But I am interested in presenting perspectives from my own experience and understanding.
What you say makes sense to me. I want to just throw something out there and see how you, like, not exactly a criticism, but nature, right? When I was in northern Canada, I live in France now. I listened to the baby seals. The mother seals would push the baby seals off onto the ice because they couldn't feed them, right? And you could hear the baby seals, making this noise, and I could project human emotions on that, or what I'm saying is you speak of nature as this wonderful, extraordinary thing, but it's also equally terrible, is it not? And much of the environmental kind of dialogue seems to be to say, oh yeah, human beings are this cancer on the earth, and nature itself is pure. We have this sort of extremely demonic quality, and we also have this extremely angelic quality at the same time, it seems to me.
There's a photographer, his name escapes me at the moment, who's very famous for photographing her own children. And it's fairly clear that they live out in the wilderness, probably in a swamp. And her children just look like animals.
Yeah.
And she doesn't have any of the questions or concerns that you're raising, because they have no existence in the context in which she has chosen to raise her children and in the way that she's chosen to raise them. So you can see this like incredible, this is one of the reasons why she's famous and very provocative. You can see this like totally feral, her children are little animals, right? They're human animals in the wilderness, being crazy, dirty, endangered by the environment, to just being, human animals. And it's beautiful, and it's haunting, and it's evocative, right? So she selected a context, and also selected modes of relation with the world, culture, her children, education, healthcare, all these things. Those selections formed a context, in the same way that those selections you make form a context, in the same way the selections I made formed a context or affected the upbringing of my child. So the first part of my answer is just context is going to dictate a lot of the fundamental variables, and then within those we're going to make both passive and active choices about how and if we crush our children's innate prodigy, how and if we recognize it, how and if we support it, how and if we reshape it.
But on the other hand, I don't find your image of this person, these wild feral children, attractive. The word paradise means walled garden. There's some sort of protection, right? You're not just at the mercy of the elements.
Yes, but of course, it's not clear whether the wall is physical or relational.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it occurs to me that the photographer in question certainly takes careful care of her children, and that there are some kinds of boundaries for them. And of course, I'm just presenting my idealized perspective based on exposure to her work. I don't really know deeply about her story or her children. But it's a beautiful exception to what we more commonly see and expect. And that's what I think intrigues me about it. It shows us like, wow, in a different context, humans can be entirely unlike what they imagine they are inside cities and, you know, civilized contexts. So that's what I find interesting about it. There's naturally a pragmatic concern for our children's safety, right? That just goes without saying. And that's a natural concern. The question is, how do we negotiate intelligently between the threats and dangers that we perceive and the purposes for which we go looking for them? Very important feature we usually overlook. And our children's innate gifts and prodigy and creative potential to exist both within, you know, culture and society and beyond it, outside of it as well, to let them have both identities, right? And to have those not necessarily be so conflicting that they have to lead to mental illness or despair or addiction, self-punishment or something.
Yeah, that makes more sense to me.
But it's really hard for individuals to accomplish it on their own with no, you know, outside of any context that's supportive of that. It's pretty tough. I think it's pretty challenging. Some parents manage it. They are in the minority by far, it seems to me.
Yeah. I'm kind of fading here, Darin.
It's okay.
My brain is getting a little foggy.
No problem. Of course, I'm happy to have a future conversation. I saw what we were doing today in my imagination anyway, primarily as like an experiment, right? So like,
yeah,
we'll try this and see how things work, and then maybe we'll do something more, you know, more formatted, more formal. If you're agreeable, and if that's something you want to do. It's my perspective that the nature of our humanity is mostly hidden from us. We are commonly exposed to something like 1 or 2% of the potentials and intelligence and relationships that we're actually emergent from, right? It's not just that we have a relationship with them, we originate in these, and most of this is invisible to us. And the primary things that make that invisible are our relationships with language, knowledge, authority, society, culture, and the lack of relationships that encourage us to explore and rediscover and recover these aspects of our humanity. So these are passionate interests that I have, and while I'm very capable of forming incisive critical statements about what we're subjected to, the societies we live in, the dangers associated with them and with language, I'm also very creatively and optimistically engaged with flipping that over, right? Once we can see what's wrong with the right kind of perspective, we can usually together, if we agree to, invert it and play a different game together. And that's my fundamental passion and interest, is playing that different game together. And I hope we've been doing at least a little bit of that here today.
Great, wonderful, good, nice conclusion and a nice summary of some of the things I've seen you say over the years. Some of the words that have come through the magic internet in my direction, and so thank you for talking to me, and I hope that this is of interest to some people, and some people get to hear some of your ideas.
Yeah, me too. And I'm not interested in speaking ex cathedra. I like conversations, right? So anyone who wants to continue the conversation or learn together or grow together, I'm up for that. You can find me on Facebook as Darin Stevenson in San Francisco, and I have a website of my own at organelle.org.
Cool. Okay, so to be continued then.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Good night.
Wise dreams, my friend.
Good afternoon in your case.
Indeed.